The rain hit Brooklyn without warning on a late Thursday afternoon. Inside a small coffee shop on Atlantic Avenue, Lucas Reed was wiping down tables near closing time when a woman in a plain, dark dress approached the counter. She had been sitting alone by the window for over an hour, reading documents, saying nothing. Now she stood in front of him, glancing at the rain hammering the glass, and said quietly, "Can you walk me home?" Lucas stared at her. He was a single man, barely making rent. He didn't know she was worth millions. Lucas Reed had been working at the coffee shop on Atlantic Avenue for almost 2 years. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted crowds or made anyone rich. A narrow storefront wedged between a laundromat and a barber shop with 12 tables, a cracked espresso machine, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Cornerstone Coffee," in faded yellow letters. The owner, a retired electrician named Frank, kept the shop running more out of stubbornness than profit. Lucas respected that. He understood what it meant to hold on to something simply because letting go felt worse. He had turned 38 in October alone in his one-bedroom apartment 6 blocks from the shop. No party, no cake, no phone call worth remembering. His divorce had been finalized 2 years before that, and the life he once thought was permanent had dissolved like sugar in hot water, quietly, completely, without any way to reverse it. He didn't talk about it, not to Frank, not to the regulars, not to anyone. He showed up for his shifts, wiped down the tables, poured the coffee, and went home. That was enough. That had to be enough. Most evenings at Cornerstone were predictable. The same handful of customers rotating through construction workers, grabbing last cups before heading to night jobs, a couple of college students nursing cold brews over textbooks, and the occasional stranger who wandered in because the subway was delayed. Lucas knew the rhythm. He could sense closing time the way some people sense weather. A slowdown in foot traffic, the light outside shifting from amber to gray, the quiet hum of a shop emptying itself naturally. That Thursday was no different until it was. She had come in around 4:30. Lucas noticed her, the way he noticed most customers briefly without attachment. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing a dark dress with no jewelry except a thin silver watch. Her hair was pulled back simply. No umbrella, no bag other than a leather folder tucked under her arm. She chose the table closest to the window without asking and ordered a black coffee. No sugar, no milk. She didn't look at her phone, didn't make a call. She opened the folder and began reading through a stack of documents, as though the rest of the world had been placed on mute. Lucas brought her the coffee, and she thanked him without looking up. He didn't take it personally. Some people came to coffee shops to disappear. He went back to his routine, refilling the drip machine, stacking clean mugs, sweeping near the door. The afternoon passed in its usual silence. 2 customers left. One arrived and left again within 10 minutes. By 5:15, only the woman and 1 elderly regular remained. The regular paid his tab and stepped outside just before the sky cracked open. The rain came all at once, as if someone had turned a faucet above the borough. Heavy sheets of water hammered the sidewalk. Wind bent the small tree planted in the concrete out front, almost sideways. Thunder rolled somewhere over the East River deep and slow, and the streetlights flickered once before holding steady. Lucas walked to the front door and looked out. The street was emptying fast, people running under awnings, ducking into bodegas, pulling jackets over their heads. Within minutes, Atlantic Avenue looked abandoned. He turned back toward the shop. The woman was still seated, but she had stopped reading. Her documents were closed inside the leather folder, and she was staring out the window the way someone watches a fire, not with fear, but with a kind of resigned attention. Lucas could tell she hadn't planned for this. No umbrella, no jacket heavy enough for a storm like this. She was stuck the same way half of Brooklyn was stuck, except she was alone in a coffee shop with a man she had never spoken to beyond placing an order. He went behind the counter and started closing out the register. Frank had already gone home at 3, leaving Lucas to lock up. The shift was almost over. Another 20 minutes, and he could flip the sign, shut the lights, and walk home in the rain the way he always did, head down, hands in pockets, shoes soaking through by the second block. He had one umbrella, an old black one with a broken spoke on the left side, stuffed behind the counter, next to a box of napkins. It barely worked, but it was something. That was when she stood up. She gathered her folder, pushed the chair in neatly, and walked toward the counter. Her steps were calm but deliberate, the kind of walk that belonged to someone used to entering rooms with purpose. She stopped in front of him, and for the first time that afternoon, Lucas looked directly at her face. Her expression was composed, but not cold. There was something underneath it, a flicker of hesitation, maybe even vulnerability, that didn't match the rest of her composure. "Can you walk me home?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet, as though she had already considered the strangeness of the question before saying it. Lucas felt the weight of the request settle over him. It wasn't a complicated sentence, 5 words. But coming from a stranger in an empty shop with a storm raging outside it, carried more than its literal meaning. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know her name, where she lived, or why she had chosen to ask him instead of calling a car or waiting out the rain. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 5:27. His shift ended at 5:30. He looked at the rain still pounding the glass, then back at her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trying to charm him or explain herself. She just stood there, holding her leather folder against her chest, waiting for an answer she clearly wasn't sure she would get. And Lucas saw something in that moment that overrode every logical reason to say no. He saw sincerity. Simple, undecorated sincerity, the kind most people had forgotten how to show. He reached behind the counter and pulled out the old umbrella. He tested it once, clicking it open and shut, checking that the broken spoke wouldn't collapse the whole thing in the wind. It held barely. He looked at her and said, "Let me just lock up." She nodded, once stepped back toward the door, and waited. Lucas moved through the closing routine faster than usual. Register shut, lights in the back off, coffee machine powered down. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the kitchen, a dark navy work jacket, thin, not made for storms, with a small plastic name tag pinned above the chest pocket. He pulled it on, took the keys from the counter, and walked toward the door, where the woman stood watching the rain. He unlocked the deadbolt, pushed the door open, and the sound of the storm rushed in like a wave, loud, immediate everywhere. He opened the umbrella and held it over both of them as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The rain hit the fabric hard, drumming a constant rhythm above their heads. Water was already pooling in the gutters, running fast toward the storm drains. The wind pushed against them from the east, and Lucas tilted the umbrella to block it, which meant the rain caught his left shoulder and soaked through his jacket almost immediately. He didn't adjust. He just walked, keeping the umbrella steady over the woman beside him, heading in the direction she had pointed east on Atlantic, then left on a side street he rarely walked down. They moved in silence for the first block. Lucas kept a careful distance between them, close enough to share the umbrella, but far enough to maintain the boundary between two strangers. He was aware of everything, the sound of her shoes on the wet pavement, the faint scent of something clean and unfamiliar, the way she held the leather folder tight against herself to keep it dry. He was also aware of himself, his worn shoes already dark with water, his work jacket with the fraying cuffs, the fact that he smelled like coffee grounds and dish soap. He was a man walking a stranger home in the rain, and he had no idea what he was doing, only that he had said yes, and now he had to follow through. The woman was the first to speak. They had made it half a block in silence, the umbrella barely wide enough to cover them both, when she turned her head slightly toward him and said, "How long have you worked there?" Her voice was calm, conversational, as though they were sitting across from each other at a table instead of pushing through a storm on a Brooklyn sidewalk. Lucas kept his eyes forward, adjusting the umbrella against a gust of wind that tried to flip it inside out. "Almost 2 years," he said. He didn't elaborate. He never did. She asked if he liked it. He thought about the question longer than most people would have expected. The rain was hammering the umbrella so hard that every word had to be spoken clearly, almost deliberately to be heard. "It's honest work," he finally said. "The owner's a good man. He doesn't ask too much, and he pays on time. That's more than a lot of places." It was the kind of answer that closed a door, without slamming it, polite, complete, and designed to prevent follow-up questions. But the woman didn't take the hint. She asked if he had always lived in Brooklyn, and Lucas said yes most of his life, except for a few years in his 20s, when he had tried living upstate, and realized he didn't belong anywhere that quiet. The umbrella's broken spoke made it tilt to the left, no matter how Lucas held it, which meant the rain kept catching her right shoulder in small, steady bursts. She didn't complain. She shifted the leather folder to her other arm and moved half a step closer to him, closing the gap he had been carefully maintaining. Lucas felt the change immediately, the nearness of another person, the warmth of it, the uncomfortable intimacy of sharing a small space with a stranger. He kept walking, eyes on the sidewalk, watching for puddles he could steer them around. His shoes were already soaked through the thin soles, offering nothing against the water pooling on the concrete. He was aware of how he must look beside her, a man in a faded navy jacket that smelled like a kitchen, with hands still rough from scrubbing counters. She didn't seem to notice any of it, or if she did, she chose not to care. She told him she had been coming to that part of Brooklyn more often lately, looking for places that felt real. Lucas didn't ask what she meant by real. He understood it the way working people understand things that don't need to be explained. There were neighborhoods in this city that had been polished so clean, they felt like showrooms, places where a cup of coffee cost $8, and every surface looked like it had been designed for a photograph. Cornerstone wasn't one of those places. It had stained ceiling tiles, a bathroom door that stuck, and coffee that was strong but never fancy. That was probably what she meant. He didn't need her to spell it out. They turned left onto a narrower street. The trees here were taller, older, and their branches hung low over the sidewalk, heavy with rain. The water came through in thick drops, even under the umbrella, and Lucas had to angle his body to block the worst of it. His jacket was completely soaked on the left side now, the fabric clinging cold against his arm. He didn't mention it. Complaining about rain when you had agreed to walk in it seemed like a waste of words. The woman glanced at his wet shoulder, and something shifted in her expression. Not pity, not guilt, but a quiet recognition that he was absorbing discomfort without a word. "You're getting drenched," she said. Lucas shrugged with the shoulder that was still dry. "It's just water." The answer came out flat, not heroic, not self-deprecating, just factual. She looked at him for a moment as if she were trying to read a book whose pages were mostly blank. Lucas kept his gaze ahead. He had learned a long time ago that the less you gave people to interpret, the less they could get wrong about you. The rain intensified near the middle of the block, coming down so hard that the umbrella became almost decorative. Visibility dropped to 20 feet. The sound of water hitting pavement metal and leaves created a wall of white noise around them. Lucas spotted an awning ahead, a green canvas overhang attached to a closed dry cleaner, and guided them toward it with a light touch on her elbow. They stepped under it, and the noise softened just enough for them to speak without raising their voices. Water streamed off the edge of the awning in a curtain, enclosing them in a small, dry rectangle no bigger than a closet. The street beyond it looked like a river. They stood side by side watching the rain. Lucas closed the umbrella and shook it once, sending a spray of water onto the already soaked sidewalk. The woman leaned her back against the dry cleaner's locked door and held her folder in both hands. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that forms between two people who don't owe each other conversation, but aren't quite ready to stop having it. Lucas looked at the water rushing along the gutter. She looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Lucas turned his head slightly, not fully facing her, but enough to show he was listening. "Do you ever think you deserve more than this?" The question landed differently than she probably intended. Lucas had heard versions of it before, from his ex-wife, from old friends who drifted away from the voice in his own head during the worst nights. It was the kind of question that assumed dissatisfaction, as though the life he was living was a waiting room for something better. He looked out at the rain and let the question sit for a moment. "I think I deserve peace," he said. His voice was low, not dramatic, not rehearsed. Just the sound of a man saying something he had thought about many times and finally believed. Stability. A day that doesn't go wrong. That's enough for me. He said it the way someone describes the weather, without trying to convince anyone, without expecting applause. It was simply what was true. The woman didn't respond right away. She stood still, her fingers pressing into the leather of her folder, her eyes fixed on the side of his face. In her world, whatever world that was, something about his answer had hit a nerve. Lucas could see it in the way her posture changed, the slight drop of her shoulders, the way she turned to look at the rain, as though she needed a moment to rearrange something inside herself. He didn't ask why. It wasn't his business, and she hadn't offered it. The rain eased slightly, not enough to stop, but enough to move. Lucas opened the umbrella again, tested the broken, spoke with his thumb, and stepped out from under the awning. The woman followed without being asked. They walked the remaining 2 blocks in a different kind of silence. Not the awkward silence of strangers, and not the comfortable silence of old friends. Something in between, a silence that carried weight, but no pressure. The street changed as they walked. The buildings grew taller. The storefronts gave way to glass lobbies and polished stone facades. The sidewalk became cleaner, wider, lined with trimmed hedges and small security cameras mounted above brass-handled doors. Lucas noticed the shift the way a man notices when he crosses into a neighborhood where his jacket and his shoes mark him as a visitor. He said nothing, but his grip on the umbrella handle tightened slightly, and the easy rhythm of his steps became just a fraction more deliberate, as if he were now conscious of each one. They stopped in front of a building that looked nothing like the block where Cornerstone sat. It was a tall residential tower with a curved glass entrance, a marble-floored lobby visible through the doors, and a doorman standing inside, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Lucas made in a week. The awning above the entrance was clean dark green, with gold lettering that spelled out a name Lucas didn't recognize, the kind of name that belonged to buildings, where apartments started in the high 6 figures and went up from there. Lucas looked at the building, then at the woman. Something rearranged itself in his understanding. The plain dark dress, the silver watch, the leather folder, the black coffee with nothing in it. He had read her as someone simple, not poor, but ordinary. The kind of woman who lived in a walk-up somewhere and took the subway. But this building wasn't for ordinary people. This building was for the kind of people who never had to check their bank accounts before buying groceries. He felt a cold knot form in his chest, separate from the rain, and he took a small step back without thinking about it. He was about to say something goodnight maybe, or just a nod and a turn, when a black sedan pulled up to the curb. It was the kind of car that didn't make noise, that glided to a stop, as though the road had been built specifically for it. The rear door opened, and a driver in a dark coat stepped out holding an umbrella that was new and intact, and 3 times the size of the one in Lucas's hand. The driver walked around to the passenger side and opened the door with a practiced motion, then looked toward the woman and said clearly and respectfully, "Ms. Hayes, we've been waiting. Your 7 o'clock was moved to 7:30. Lucas felt the words hit him like cold water on top of the rain already soaking through his clothes. Ms. Hayes, a driver, a 7 o'clock meeting rescheduled as a courtesy. He looked at her and saw her face change, not dramatically, but enough. A flicker of something that might have been embarrassment or frustration, or the particular discomfort of being identified when you had been trying to remain invisible. She looked at the driver, then back at Lucas, and opened her mouth to speak. But Lucas was already stepping back. He lowered the umbrella slightly, letting the rain hit him full on as though he no longer deserved the small shelter he had been carrying. The conversation on the sidewalk, the question under the awning, the quiet walk through the rain, all of it reshuffled in his mind like cards being redealt. She wasn't a woman who needed help getting home. She was someone with a private car and a schedule and a life that existed in a different currency than his. He felt foolish. Not angry. Not betrayed. Just misplaced, like a book returned to the wrong shelf. He looked at her one more time. The rain was running down his face and into the collar of his jacket. She was standing between him and the open car door, her expression caught somewhere between composure and something more raw. Lucas gave a short nod, the kind you give to someone you'll never see again, and turned away. He started walking back in the direction they had come from alone, the broken umbrella tilted against the wind, his shoes filling with water at every step. Behind him, the sedan idled at the curb, its headlights cutting 2 pale lines through the rain. He had made it maybe 30 steps when he heard her behind him. Not the click of heels, the rain was too heavy for that, but the quick, uneven sound of someone moving fast on a wet sidewalk, not running exactly, but close. Lucas didn't turn around. He kept walking the broken umbrella, catching the wind at a bad angle, his left hand gripping the handle hard enough to feel the metal pressing into his palm. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself to keep going, to walk back to his apartment, to hang the wet jacket on the door, and forget the whole evening the way he had forgotten 100 other things that didn't belong in his life. Lucas. Her voice cut through the rain, sharp and clear, using his name for the first time. He hadn't told her his name. She must have read it off the tag pinned to his jacket, the small rectangle of plastic he had stopped noticing months ago. Hearing it now in her voice in the middle of a storm on a street where he didn't belong made him stop. Not because he wanted to, because the sound of his own name spoken with that much urgency by someone who had no reason to care caught something inside him that he couldn't override with logic. He stood still, rain hitting the top of the umbrella in a constant drum roll. He didn't turn around yet. He heard her steps getting closer. Slower now. And then she was beside him. Slightly out of breath, the leather folder held low at her side. Water was streaming down her face. Her dark dress was soaked through at the shoulders, and her silver watch caught the glow of a streetlight as she raised one hand to push wet hair away from her eyes. She looked nothing like the composed woman who had sat by the window at Cornerstone, reading documents in silence. She looked like someone who had made a decision that cost her something. "I didn't ask you because I needed help getting home," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a roughness at the edges that hadn't been there before, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deeper than casual conversation. "I have a car. I have a driver. I have an apartment with a doorman who would have walked out with an umbrella if I'd called. I know how this looks. I know what you're thinking right now." Lucas turned to face her. The rain was falling between them in silver lines under the streetlight. He didn't speak. He let her continue because he could see that she needed to, and because he had learned that sometimes the most respectful thing you could do for another person was to simply stay still and listen. She lowered her gaze for a moment, then looked at him directly. "When people find out who I am, what I do, what I'm worth, everything changes. Every conversation becomes a transaction. Every smile has a price behind it. People start calculating before they even finish shaking my hand. They look at me and they see a number, a connection, an opportunity, not a person." She said it without self-pity. It was a statement of fact, delivered the same way Lucas had described his own life earlier, plainly without decoration, without asking anyone to feel sorry for her. "I come to places like your coffee shop because nobody there knows my name. Nobody cares about my portfolio. I can sit by a window and drink bad coffee and just exist." Lucas almost smiled at that. The coffee at Cornerstone wasn't great. He knew it. Frank knew it. Every regular knew it. But hearing someone like her call it bad out loud carried a particular honesty that he respected. He didn't interrupt. She took a breath and continued, the rain still falling around them, as though the city had decided to give them this moment, whether they wanted it or not. Tonight you walked me 6 blocks in a storm with a broken umbrella and a jacket that isn't waterproof, and you never once asked me what I do for a living. You never asked where I went to school, or what company I run, or how much my apartment costs. You didn't try to impress me. You didn't try to sell me anything. You just walked next to me and held an umbrella over my head and talked to me like I was just a woman who needed to get home. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, not dramatically. Not enough to call it crying, but enough for Lucas to hear the fracture in it. Do you have any idea how long it's been since someone treated me that way? Lucas stood in the rain and let the question settle. He realized that she was right. He hadn't asked her a single personal question during the entire walk. Not her job, not her address, not her last name. It hadn't occurred to him. Not because he was incurious, but because it hadn't seemed relevant. She was a woman who needed to get home in a storm, and he had an umbrella. That was the entire equation. He hadn't needed to know anything else. The fact that this basic decency, walking someone home without an agenda, had become so rare in her world that it moved her to chase him down a sidewalk in the rain. Said something he didn't know how to respond to. He looked at her for a long moment. The sting he had felt, what he thought was anger, what was probably just the sharp edge of feeling small beside someone large, began to loosen in his chest. He wasn't angry at her. He had been angry at the gap between them, at the reminder that the world sorted people into categories based on things they couldn't control. But standing here, looking at a woman who was soaked to the bone and out of breath, and asking him to see her as human, he understood that the gap wasn't between them. It was around both of them separately, like 2 people trapped in different rooms of the same building. "I didn't know who you were," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the rain. "I still don't really." It was the truest thing he could offer. She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. The tension in her jaw relaxed. The tightness around her eyes softened. "Charlotte," she said. Just the name, nothing else. No last name, repeated, no title, no company attached. She offered it the way you hand someone a key, small, ordinary, but meaning, access. Lucas held it for a second, then nodded. "Lucas," he said, even though she already knew. It felt right to say it back, to make the exchange equal. They stood in the rain, 2 people who had just introduced themselves after walking 6 blocks together, and something about the absurdity of it made the moment feel more honest than anything that had come before. "Thank you," Charlotte said. She didn't reach for her wallet. She didn't offer him a business card or suggest a favor she could do for him later. She didn't try to close the distance between their lives with money or promises. She just said, "Thank you." And the way she said it, low direct, as if she were signing something binding, made Lucas understand that she meant it in a way most people never mean those 2 words. She was thanking him not for the umbrella, not for the walk, but for the absence of everything else, for the questions he didn't ask, for the calculations he didn't make, for the simple, unglamorous act of treating her like a person whose worth had nothing to do with her net worth. Lucas nodded. It was a small movement, just a dip of the chin, but it carried something he hadn't felt in a long time. For years, his value had been measured in hourly shifts and monthly rent payments. He was the man who poured coffee and wiped tables and locked up at night. He was the man who couldn't afford to replace the broken spoke on his umbrella or buy a jacket that kept out the rain. But standing here in this moment, he felt the full weight of something that didn't cost anything and couldn't be earned by working harder, the recognition that who he was, separate from what he had, was enough. They stood in the rain for another few seconds, neither moving, neither needing to. Then Charlotte stepped back toward the waiting sedan, the driver still holding the door open. She gave Lucas one last look, Not a goodbye, not a promise, just an acknowledgement, and got into the car. The door closed. The headlights swept across the wet pavement as the sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. Lucas stood alone on the sidewalk, rain falling on the umbrella, watching the taillights dissolve into the gray. He turned and walked home. The storm was already weakening, the thunder moving east over the water, the rain thinning into something lighter and less urgent. His jacket would take 2 days to dry. He would be back at Cornerstone by 9 the next morning, wiping tables and filling the drip machine and doing everything the same way he always did. But something had shifted quietly in a place he couldn't name. He walked the 6 blocks back with his head up instead of down, and he didn't rush. The next morning, the sky over Brooklyn was clean and pale, the kind of blue that only appears after a hard rain has scrubbed the air. Lucas arrived at Cornerstone at 8:45, 15 minutes before his shift. Frank was already inside, standing near the front window, with a confused expression and a piece of paper in his hand. He told Lucas that a woman had called first thing that morning, identifying herself as a regular customer, and had arranged to cover the cost of repairing the roof above the front entrance. The awning had been leaking for months. Frank had been putting buckets under the drip every time it rained, patching it with tape that never held. The woman hadn't left a full name. She said she had been coming to the shop for a while and wanted to help. She asked that it not be made into a big deal. Frank shrugged and said he wasn't going to argue with that. Lucas didn't say anything. He tied his apron, started the espresso machine, and began setting up the tables for the morning. Around 10:15, the door opened, and Charlotte walked in. She was dressed the same way as the day before, simple, unadorned, carrying the same leather folder. She chose the same table by the window and sat down without looking around the room. Lucas watched her from behind the counter for a moment, then poured a cup of black coffee and carried it to her table. He set it down in front of her. She looked up at him, and there it was, a quiet, unhurried smile. Neither of them mentioned the night before. Neither of them mentioned the rain, the sedan, the driver, or the name Ms. Hayes. There was nothing to explain and nothing to undo. Lucas went back behind the counter. Charlotte opened her folder and began reading. Outside, the sun was drying the last of the puddles on Atlantic Avenue, and the broken awning above the entrance dripped one final drop of leftover rain onto the sidewalk before going still. Inside, the coffee machine hummed. A regular walked in and ordered the usual. The morning continued ordinary and unremarkable, except for the quiet understanding that now lived between a man behind a counter and a woman by the window. Two people who had seen each other clearly once in a storm and understood that the most valuable thing either of them had given that night was not shelter from the rain, but the simple, unmeasured act of being treated as exactly who they were.